When something does not develop as you had hoped for or as you had expected, then you experience an unwelcome disappointment. For example, your offer for a new house which you wanted to buy did not get accepted. You experienced a separation, a breakup, or you didn't get the job you applied for. Or you are mad at social media because a post insulted you. But otherwise, you have everything what you need. You have a good life, you are perfectly healthy, no medical problems, but you still feel something is missing, still not completely happy, but upset. Why is that? Why are we sometimes emotionally unhappy despite objectively everything seems to be fine? Look at people in Gaza or in parts of the Ukraine where they have to fight for the very basic water, food, shelter. But here in the so-called developed Western world, we are sometimes grumpy for no good reason. It is true, we survive and we live in good conditions. So why are we upset just because we think something is missing or because we have been disappointed? Why are we sometimes miserable emotionally, even if we know objectively that our situation is not so bad physically? Hi, I'm Manfred Stapff, your host of the Real World Evidence Perspective, which brings you truth, data, and candid context. For those of you who know my podcast and watch and listen and are hopefully a subscriber, you know that the podcast is usually about science, research, medicine, simply about facts and real world, as the title suggests. So why am I today talking about loss, depression, disappointments, frustration, breakups? What does this have to do with the real world evidence? Well, it has something to do with our reaction. Whatever happened is a fact, it occurred, it's a true story. However, the way how we react is often very unreal, very emotional, full of doubts, because what actually happened is not what we expected. Therefore, we question the facts and the reality, and we behave in a different way, in a different dimension, but not in the real world. It is misinformation in our own head, and our brain can create conspiracy theories against ourselves. Objectively, we live a good life. We have everything what is needed to survive, but emotionally we often react depressed. If this was the end of the world when something happens to us which we don't like. Overall, and statistically speaking, the depression incidence and the suicide rates are lower in high-income areas where the physical living conditions are better, but nevertheless, the individual reaction towards an unfortunate event can be very dramatic, even if someone lives a rich life and has everything what we usually consider necessary to be happy. Why is that so? This has something to do with the way how the brain manages facts, information, and emotions. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a psychiatrist. And I'm also not a TV life coach like Dr. Phil, for example. But I would nevertheless like to try to share with you some thoughts about emotions and the reality in how our brain deals with unfortunate events. To do that, let's talk first about the hierarchy of needs. Abraham Harold Maslow was an American psychologist. He lived from 1908 to 1970, and he created the so-called Maslow hierarchy of needs. This is a theory of psychological human needs and how we see their priorities. It starts at the bottom with the physiological needs, what you immediately need to survive, like air, water, food, shelter. The next higher level is safety, like personal security, employment, health, property. Above that comes love and belongings, like friendship, intimacy, a sense of connection. Higher than that is esteem, like status, recognition, respect, freedom. And on top of the pyramid is self-actualization, the desire to become the best of oneself, to always fulfill the best way possible. When we have a look at this pyramid, we can see that the base of the pyramid is physical survival. And the more we go to the top, the more it is emotional, hope, growth, psychological fulfillment. Each level has a biochemical correspondent, a molecule. At the basis, it's oxygen, water, food, heating, shelter, all needed for basic survival. On the higher level, where we want to feel safe and calm, our body produces oxytocin, a hormone which reduces anxiety and lowers stress. It is also commonly known as the love hormone. On the top level, when it comes to self-esteem, we produce serotonin, which promotes confidence, dopamine, which drives motivation, endorphin to reduce stress, and testosterone for increased energy. So each level has their own goal and their own way of expressing chemicals, hormones or neurotransmitters. Now it becomes clear that a deficit in the higher level cannot easily be compensated by an abundance of a lower level, because each level has their own specific physiological equivalent which is necessary to fulfill the level's needs. For example, a lack of love or a loss of friendship. If someone experienced a breakup, it's not so easy to console this person by saying, "Don't worry, you have a good life, let's go and have a good dinner." In such situation, it's not water, food, oxygen, heat or shelter what the body needs. No, the brain needs a stimulant to produce oxytocin. And this stimulant would be positive social interaction, physical touch, emotional connection. Another example, lack of self-esteem can be caused by relationship issues, performance failures in the job, or by pressure from social media. Even if one has a nice house, enough money for food, and is otherwise physically perfectly healthy, the body's lack of serotonin, dopamine or endorphin lets the person feel worthless and insecure. Such a disconnect is the reason why we cannot easily console someone who got bullied or lost love by just saying, "Don't worry, you have a good life, you have enough money to eat." This would not help to compensate the loss of the needed hormones on the self-esteem level. Consolation needs to be on the level of the need which has been violated. For example, winning a tennis match can help to establish self-esteem. A big hug may, for a few moments, increase oxytocin levels. So such actions may be more helpful than words. In other words, an abundance of air, water and food cannot replace the lack of love or the loss of dignity. These needs are regulated in different parts of the brain. And these parts are not always very well connected and do not always very well communicate to each other. Our frontal cortex is the part of the brain immediately behind our forehead, is mainly responsible for our logical thinking, and more centrally located behind the frontal cortex is the limbic system, which maintains memories and emotions. And there are locations in the limbic system with fancy names like hippocampus, amygdala, hypothalamus. The limbic system is evolutionary older and can react very fast without thinking, often intuitively, to handle threats or anticipated dangerous situations. The frontal cortex came relatively recently into the evolution of humans. It is newer, slower, and requires more time to process logic and to think about long-term consequences. This explains why instinctive fight or flight reactions can happen quickly, but sometimes don't make any logical sense in our modern society. For example, when we react too spontaneously to a social media post or to a newspaper headline. This is because the connection between the limbic system and the frontal cortex are not always working perfectly. In addition, they mature only during adolescence and are not perfect until a person reaches the age of 20, lower to 30. So this is an explanation for the risky behavior and emotional volatility seen in younger people. Indeed, accidents, overdose, and suicide are the main causes of death in the age group 20 to 40. So let's have a look at some of these numbers. Based on census data and surveys, one can estimate that a person in a relationship has an approximate 30% chance to experience a breakup in a given year. This would make a number of approximately 30 to 60 million separation events in the United States per year. Quite a significant number. So in terms of quantity, such events are relatively frequent. And in terms of quality and consequences, they can be devastating. The National Violent Death Reporting System, NVDRS, estimates that there are approximately 10,000 to 15,000 suicides per year with a documented relationship background as a contributing factor. Fortunately, this is less than 5 in 10,000 breakups, so still not very frequent. So that's enough about numbers. Let's talk about what happens in our heads, even in our frontal cortex, when we experience a disappointing event. When we experience a loss, unexpected event did not happen, a partner, girlfriend, boyfriend dumps you, or a spouse files for divorce, then it sometimes feels as if the earth would stop turning, the sun would never appear again, the world would crash down, life would not make any sense anymore. So objectively, such feelings, of course, have no basis in reality. But it feels like that. The earth will not stop turning. But where does this overwhelming mental reaction come from? How close is it related to real world? Here we have to look at one thing which has a huge influence on how we react, our expectations. When we experience a disappointment, for example, we did not get the job we applied for, or we got dumped by a romantic partner we planned a future with, then we are disappointed because what we expected did not happen. In other words, what we expected, what we hoped for, what we dreamed about did not happen. The word disappointment already explains it, what happens. First, we were appointed to an idea in the future, then it did not happen, and now we were disappointed, meaning in our minds, a certain ideal, an expectation, a fantasy, it does not become real, we get disappointed. It is a separation from what we had expected. This is what happens in our minds. It becomes clear also in other languages. In Spanish or in French, it is déception.Ception can mean companionship, receiving acceptance. Then deception is sadness by the non-fulfillment of one's expectations. In German it is Enttäuschung, and these words contain also the words for deception or for dishonesty. So how do people react to disappointments? When expectations are not met, we can react with shock, disbelief, anger. Usually we are searching for a reason. We are asking, why did it happen? We have self-criticism, or we have the urgent need for answers. All of these reactions can be accompanied by physical symptoms, sleep disruptions, chest tightness, or gastrointestinal symptoms. These can be symptoms of the chemical imbalance in the brain among the respective hormones or neurotransmitters. Especially in the first 2 to 3 days, the disappointed person may be emotionally extremely volatile and may have cravings to re-establish the contact, sometimes even by stalking. Which personality types are more susceptible? People who are highly sensitive, relationship-focused, idealistic, or harmony-seeking often get hurt the most. Also, introverted narcissists, people with a certain degree of stubbornness or with OCD, and people who have low self-esteem and the desperate need for social acceptance are more at risk. The initial reactions may be purely emotionally driven, unreasonable, and can worsen the situation instead of leading to a solution. In this early phase, we may desperately try to change the facts and still try to adjust them according to our initial expectation. However, if we didn't get the job which we applied for, or our idealized romantic partner rejected us, or the apartment was rented out to another person, changing the hiring practices of the company where we applied, or changing the mindset of the desired romantic partner is hardly possible. In contrast, it costs a lot of energy. It is distracting, depressing, and eventually in vain, because we have no actual influence on the decision-making of the other party. It simply does not have anything to do with reality if we seriously think we could turn things around. We absolutely have to let go of the need to control others' actions. You cannot control others, but you can control your own reaction and your own decisions. You have to reclaim your energy and power and direct them towards your own life and happiness. Of course, this is easier said than done, but it's reality. It has nothing to do with real world if you assume that by huge investment of energy and effort, you could change things which actually are out of your control. In such situations, which are highly emotionally loaded, we are very susceptible to manipulating the reality in a way we subconsciously want to see it. This is a so-called bias, which, by the way, also happens in the very fact and data-based world of science and medical research. Every medical researcher knows that. This is the AAA bias. First, we develop a prejudice by our first observation or by a scientific hypothesis which we want to confirm. This is the anchoring bias. Then we collect and take into consideration only those data, those information which is easily available and which somehow is connected to our hypothesis. This is the availability bias. And finally, we only accept results which are in line with our original hypothesis or which confirm our prejudice. This is the affirmation bias. In medicine, for example, this is the case with symptoms which are allegedly connected to a medication or to a vaccine. They get more and more and more often reported, and the more and more they get reported, they get detected and get reported again, until they finally end up in the patient information, in the prescription information as a side effect. An analog situation in the romantic relationship world would consider the following observation in a bar. Look at how he smiles at other women. This is the availability bias. Perhaps he just has a good conversation. And then they disappear together from the bar to the exit. Oh, certainly they hooked up and go home together. This is the affirmation bias. Wait a moment before you jump into judgment. Perhaps he just wants to be a gentleman and bring the woman safely to a taxi. The fact that he comes back after 5 minutes alone gets disregarded. We can also call this self-fulfilling prophecy trap. Our brain cares more about how to survive than an accurate version of the reality. This can lead to the so-called useful fiction about the world. This means we tend to perceive what fits into our mental concept rather than the actual facts. So what should we do after a big disappointment? If there are situations or locations which used to be closely connected to the reason for the disappointment, for example, places you used to go together with the partner who dumped you, or a street with the car dealer where you wanted to buy the car of your dreams but you couldn't afford it, or the neighborhood where you wanted to buy the house which you didn't get, then avoiding these areas will reduce the risk of getting reminded what happened. It is often the visual memory, the sound or the overall environment which reactivates the emotional areas in the brain and memories which can again cause sentiments of disappointment, rejection, or feeling of being mistreated. For some people this is specifically true for a certain type of music, especially when it comes to a relationship which has ended and if the music has special romantic notion. It's better to avoid such music by all means. This brings me to one of the biggest cliches after a breakup. We still can be friends. This is good for movies, but not for the real world. Friendship and romantic love are regulated in the brain by different areas and different mechanisms. Social friendship, affiliation and trust are managed mainly by the frontal cortex, with only moderate involvement of dopamine. Romantic love and intimacy, however, involve hypothalamus and amygdala, with high level of dopamine and especially oxytocin. Thus, friendship cannot replace love. In contrast, trying to stay friends can make it worse. Repeated contact will again and again refresh memory and crystallize the chemical connection in the brain, harden the pain of rejection. That's why some experts suggest a healing period of 3 to 6 months of no contact to successfully transition from partners to friends. I would even add the following. Whoever suggests continued friendship after breakup of romantic love, we still can be friends. This person most likely took the relationship already mostly from the frontal cortex, more as a task, as an adventure, as a temporary escapade in life, rather than real emotional, deep affectional bonding managed in hypothalamus. Otherwise, he or she would not be able to even suggest friendship after breakup. Think about it. This means our relationship was only between friends from the very beginning. We were only friends, perhaps friends with benefits, who knows. While staying friends at least after the breakup of a romantic relationship is not an option. Thoughts should be converted towards the future after any type of disappointment. Thoughts or discussions which are oriented to the past lead to feelings of revenge, guilt or regret, which overall increases negative mood. Instead, one should focus on the future, what can be done, what needs to be better next time, which good things can wait in the future. This helps to direct thoughts into a more positive direction rather than the negative past-oriented approach. Usually it's simply unavoidable to look back because this is what we have in our memory. It is readily available, in contrast to the future which we have to imagine. But it is necessary to move the negative past-oriented thoughts into something positive. For example, being grateful for what we have experienced and what other good things may be coming and waiting in the future. Sometimes we need a person to talk to, not necessarily because we expect a lot of help from this person, but just because we want to speak out. If no person is available, write it down for yourself. Write a journal, which most likely only for yourself. Write a letter, which most likely never gets sent. Write a book, which perhaps never gets published. Or create a podcast, which never gets distributed. This is the moment where I can make a little bit of advertising promotion for my own book, Real-World Evidence Unveiled, Navigating the Maze of Modern Misinformation. It's available on Amazon, ebook, hardcover, paperback. Look at it, you will see a lot in it. All such productive and creative activities help to better organize the emotional chaos in your head. Put it into categories, put sentences together, pretend that you tell it to somebody. This forces you to add some reason into the emotional soup of pain, agony, disappointment, distress, and all these things which contribute to the situation where you do not feel like yourself. In stress situations after a disappointment, your brain tricks you out. It creates misinformation, overreaction, conspiracy theories, and you have to bring it back to the real world. The most important point is avoid the urge to act immediately. We have an inborn fight or flight reflex, but this was only helpful tens of thousands of years ago when we lived in caves and had to fight or run away because of dangerous animals. This is usually not anymore the case when we have to deal with rejection, embarrassment, disappointments, or breakups in the 21st century. Thank you for watching the Real-World Evidence Perspective, which brings you truth, data, and candid context. Don't forget to like, forward, comment, or subscribe the podcast, whatever you feel appropriate. And don't forget to order my book at Amazon. Thank you very much.